All right, well, I'm going to start with my own translation of 1 Peter 2:11 through 17. What I did was I simply did a find and replace. Every time that the word you showed up, I replaced it with a plural. So 1 Peter 2:11. Dear friends, I urge y'all collectively as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against y'all's souls. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse y'all collectively of doing wrong, they may see y'all's collective good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit y'all's collective selves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, y'all collectively should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use y'all's collective freedom to cover up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Now, when David asked me to preach on this passage, I don't remember whether he asked for verses 13 through 17 or 11 through 17. But it doesn't make any difference because I'm going to jump all around in 1 Peter and around the Bible. And we'll do some history and some linguistics just because that's the way my mind works. And I apologize for not having an outline sheet like David does, because that's not how my mind works. At the time Peter wrote the letter, by the way, the emperor was Nero. And Peter was writing to Christians who were experiencing a bitter persecution from that emperor. I want to begin by explaining the translation's changes. Every language has both strengths and weaknesses. And one weakness in English is the failure to distinguish second person plural and singular pronouns, or those that are formal or informal. In English, you is always you. Whether Paul is speaking to his close associate Timothy, where the Spanish would use tú, or to King Festus, where it would be usted, or addressing the mob in Athens, where Spanish would use ustedes. In English, they are both just you. This is important because 21st century Americans are very individualistic. And prior to the Reformation, and by the way, happy Reformation Day, it was Friday. Prior to the Reformation, most readers of the Bible lived in more communal societies. Certainly, the writers of the Bible did. Peter begins this letter to God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. This is not even to just one congregation or to one city. This is to all the Christians in a very large area as a group. If we are to claim that this letter was also written to us, we must see ourselves as members of God's elect, scattered exiles. Also, unlike us, these people understood that they were exiles, not that they had left the locations of their births, but the places where they had been born were the colonized territories of a foreign military power. And to understand the message of the letter, we must put ourselves in the same frame of mind. We were born in a place that has been colonized by Satan. Here we battle in the spirit, not with flesh and blood. Christians could fall back on a long list of instructions on how to live as exiles. For example, Jeremiah 29, beginning with verse 4. This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them, and plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and father sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may give birth to sons and daughters, and grow in numbers there, and do not decrease. Seek the prosperity of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord in its behalf. For in its prosperity will be your prosperity. For this is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says: do not let your prophets who are in your midst, or your diviners, deceive you, and do not listen to their interpretations of your dreams which you dream, for they prophesy falsely to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. So in this passage, I see several things that are apropos to both the Christians who Peter is writing to and to our situation. First, exiles should take an active part in civic life, as active as they are allowed. Even ordinary Babylonian citizens did not get to vote. But if the right to vote had been extended to the exiles, I suspect Jeremiah would have included voting within the idea of seeking the prosperity of his city. Secondly, God's message through Jeremiah is to abide. He's saying, don't be so eager for the better place you long for that you forget to live out today in the place you find yourself. Build houses, have kids, marry them off. I do think that the implied instruction is that they should marry them to other members of God's community. God wants the community to grow, not decrease. Plant gardens. You can walk around behind the house here and see a very nice garden, the kind of thing that, no, is not there?
Not this year.
Not this year?
I'm sorry.
Oh.
Wait till next year.
Okay, we'll do this next year. Pray for the city, the whole city, and everyone living in it. And finally, expect that there will be false prophets that originate from within your own exile population. I think this warning is especially important for us today. Over the last 12 or 15 years, American Christianity has produced a number of self-proclaimed prophets. Some have written books. I own a copy of one. Some are touring the country as revival meeting tent shows. But when their prophetic utterances fail to come true, these so-called prophets simply change the wording and repeat them anew. But Jeremiah told us, the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says, do not let your prophets who are in your midst or your diviners deceive you. Do not listen to their interpretations of your dreams which you dream, for they prophesy falsely to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. Another biblical passage that would have been familiar to the Christians who received this message would be Caesar's, or Christ's instructions to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. In the immediate context, Jesus was referring to taxes, but of course it goes beyond that. Citizens submit to traffic laws, serve jury duty when we are called, serve in the military when we are called, and we vote. Taxes were paid in coins bearing the images of kings and emperors. On the other hand, we are, each of us by ourselves, but also collectively, living images of God. At all times, we should be rendering or submitting our entire selves to God. One final thought about exiles, only slightly off the subject. Repeatedly throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites were commanded to show special consideration for the foreigners in their midst. Because God is concerned about the vulnerable, and foreigners tend to be defenseless, the Israelites were to show special concern for the foreigners living among them. They were enjoined against mistreating them. And these passages are scattered all through Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Jeremiah, and also the minor prophets. They were commanded to respect foreigners and to give them full legal rights, remembering that they themselves had once lived as foreigners. Worldwide, as of mid-2024, there are an estimated 122 million people who have been displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. About half of those have managed to stay inside their own countries. About 38 million are refugees in another country, and 8 million are asylum seekers. Although those asylum seekers have become a major political issue in the United States, we actually take in comparatively few, viewed alongside the numbers taken in by other countries. 2/3 of the world's refugees come from Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, or Afghanistan. And we, as a congregation or individuals in our congregation, have taken an interest in some refugees in Syria and a refugee from Ukraine. Unfortunately, the ministry to Syrian refugees that we helped last December has been dispersed from southern Lebanon because of the war. Some of the workers have gone north and others have gone to Egypt. Happily, each one of those workers is now busy in a ministry in their new location. Our money actually went to ministry being done in the Kurdish refugee camps in Syria on the border with Turkey. I inquired yesterday whether that camp had been affected by a Turkish offensive that's been bombing Kurds living in Syria, and apparently not. But we have brothers and sisters working to share the gospel in some very dangerous places. Many of this displaced and persecuted are Christians. Each year, the Voice of the Martyrs ministry sets aside the first Sunday in November, that's today, as International Day of Prayer for Persecuted Christians. Certainly, as we vote, we need to keep those places in mind. A statistic I saw this week, I was wondering how many Christians had been killed, martyred, in just Nigeria all by itself. And since Boko Haram began persecution Christians just in Nigeria, no other country, it's scattered all across the Sahel of Africa, but just in Nigeria since 2009, 55,000 Christians have been killed. And it's the kind of thing where Boko Haram comes into a village, surrounds the church, and burns it down with everybody in it. There are also 4.4 million stateless people, individuals who have been unable to establish citizenship anywhere. These are people who literally have no country. Some of you know a young man who I have been trying to help for 24 years. He is in that situation. He is a citizen of no country through no fault of his own. The good news is that as of last week, he is now the father of a United States citizen. And mother and child are doing well, and the father is ecstatic, though he would like to be a citizen somewhere. Unfortunately, there are people in our political situation who want to cancel the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship, making this situation even worse. The Vances have also tried to help a young man in citizenship limbo, yet the issue is beyond what churches can do alone and ought to be in our prayers and our voting. As we read 1 Peter, I think it's important to see ourselves in Peter's opening address. We are to consider ourselves as members of God's elect, exiles and scattered. One other thought as we work our way through the lead-up passages to our focus text. In 1 Peter 2, 4 through 6, as y'all collectively come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, y'all collectively also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, as I was mulling this passage in one of those half sleeps in the middle of the night, I started thinking about Genesis 11. Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Brick is man-made. Stones are made by God. As we Christians belong to what God intended from the beginning, or we as Christians belong to what God intended from the beginning, and what the idolaters at Babel wanted to short circuit. I mentioned this to my son Timothy this morning, and he said, "Oh yeah, shepherd of Hermas." And I said, "What?" Turns out the connection between a brick tower built by human hands and a spiritual house made by living stones had been expanded by a second century church father. I read up a little bit on the shepherd of Hermas, but I think I'll leave it at that. With all of this as introduction to our main passage, Peter writes, this is 1 Peter 2:11, "Dear friends, I urge y'all collectively, as foreigners and exiles," again he repeats the foreigners and exiles from the salutation at the beginning of the letter, "to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against y'all's souls. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse y'all collectively of doing wrong, they may see y'all's collective good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit y'all's selves, for the Lord's sake, to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is by God's will that by doing good, y'all collectively should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use y'all's collective freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor." Peter calls us foreigners and exiles. How does this fit with the idea of Christian nationalism? Christian nationalism posits that this is a Christian nation and therefore needs to be run according to our rules and for our benefit. It would be wonderful if our sweet demeanor caused the pagans around us to want to follow Christian patterns. But do we, as foreigners and exiles, have a right to demand this? We do live in a time when we are surrounded by pagans, and they do accuse us of wrongdoing. Peter will come back to this in chapter 3, but I want to deal first with Peter's instruction that we should live as God's slaves. This is important to understanding the passage on submitting to government authorities. Most translations use the word submitting. Some say subject yourselves. One says accept the authority of. In the passage following this, Peter lines up a parallel instruction, this time about slaves submitting to masters, and then a third passage about wives submitting to unbelieving husbands. Taken together, these three parallel passages help us to understand each of them individually. 1 Peter 2:18, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit y'all's selves to y'all's masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because they are conscious of God. But how is it to y'all's collective credit if y'all receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if y'all collectively suffer for doing good and y'all collectively endure it, this is commendable before God. To this y'all collectively were called, because Christ suffered for y'all collectively, leaving y'all collectively an example that y'all collectively should follow in his steps. The parallel instruction to wives comes in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Wives, in the same way, submit y'all's selves to y'all's own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. When they see the purity and reverence of y'all's lives, y'all's beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that y'all's inner selves, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. Y'all collectively are her daughters if y'all collectively do what is right and do not give way to fear. This passage brought to mind two recent cases from England. One a woman and one a man. In each case, they were arrested for praying outside an abortion clinic. They were not obstructing traffic. They were not praying out loud. They silently were sitting there with their heads bowed. The police had to come over and ask them if they were praying. Yeah, fortunately, England does not have a Bill of Rights like we do. Neither does Canada nor Australia. And so there are some things there. We have some blessings that we should be really thankful for. Peter says, do what's right with purity and reverence, and do not give way to fear. The pattern in each of these commands is that the Christian, rather than being concerned about protecting their own rights in relation to a likely unjust and perhaps cruel government master or husband, is to submit because Christ suffered for us, submitting to the cross, and in hopes that our submission will win over the unjust government master husband. Wow. Can we find some recent examples of Christians actually living this out in the political sphere? I think we can. And I think we can find it in the civil rights movement that came out of the black church in America. White America tends to overlook the fact that the black church has a higher percentage of its demographic in church every Sunday than the white church. And it has been that way for a long time. But it is also a demographic that has suffered long history of living under harsh oppression. When Martin Luther King Jr. led marches for civil rights, no one was allowed to take part until they had signed a 10-point pledge. Remember, these were people who were about to face angry mobs, fire hoses, police dogs, arrests, and cold jail cells. But they were also the people who accomplished the greatest advance in civil rights that this nation has ever seen, other than the abolition of slavery itself. Abolition came through the Civil War, which tore the nation apart and cost 600,000 lives. This is the Pledge of Nonviolence written by Martin Luther King Jr. and signed by his marchers in 1963. 1. As you prepare to march, meditate on the life and teachings of Jesus. 2. Remember, the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. 3. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. 4. Pray daily to be used by God that all men and women might be free. 5. Sacrifice personal wishes that all might be free. 6. Observe with friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. 7. Perform regular service for others and the world. 8. Refrain from violence of fist, tongue, and heart. 9. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. And 10. Follow the directions of the movement leaders and of the captains on demonstrations. 1 Peter 3:13 says, "And who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be in dread." This next line should be in the text of every discussion or Facebook post we're part of during the election season. 1 Peter 3:15. "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, but with gentleness and respect. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who disparage your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better, if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what is right rather than for doing what is wrong." We actually have it considerably better than the original recipients of Peter's letter. Instead of the Roman Empire, where the emperor was sovereign, we live in a republic, where we the people are the sovereign. That is also a post-Reformation idea. If you asked a Roman emperor, "Who elected you emperor?" the answer would be that the gods did. Post-Reformation, we have presidents and prime ministers elected by the people. That should heighten the importance of us voting as a religious duty. Under the temple system, only the Levitical priests had been chosen to perform such religious duties. In a democracy, every citizen is chosen to perform the duty. And that's a lot to pray about as our country goes to the polls.